Hi everyone, this is Ellen from Astrology Journal. I want to talk about the chart for Saturn Retrograde. That happened this morning. I'm recording this in the afternoon on July 13th. So that happened July 13th at 5 minutes after midnight Eastern Daylight Time. So I want to talk about this chart, and this will be I think I will do one more reading this month besides the next new moon. So I'll do the new moon reading, and then I'll also do a reading for Mercury retrograde, because I think Mercury retrograde this time is going to be is a really important energy, partly because it's happening within the context of all of these outer planet retrogrades, but also, as we'll see when we look at this chart, it's interesting to consider in relationship to this chart. So it's a lot of videos that I'm putting out, but it's an important month. I feel like the energies are really important. I feel like this is a real kind of like a pivot point for humanity, energetically, symbolically. So I think it's really helpful to look at these charts. And then I think we're going to be seeing an evolution of humanity over the next few months and next few years that are going to move us beyond our current tendencies, and that's part of what I'm going to talk about in this reading. So there are two themes that I see in this chart that are interrelated, I believe. So one is the idea of moving beyond our brutish ways, of choosing something different than that. And then the other is this idea of individuation, choosing individuation. So let's start by looking at the Sabian symbol. So here's the retrograde cycle. Saturn entered its reconnaissance period on April 6th, and then it reached its first midpoint. So the way that I look at retrograde cycles, the midpoint of the cycle is, when people talk about the midpoint of the retrograde cycle, they're usually talking about the midpoint of the retrograde period. In other words, the midpoint of when the planet is actually turning retrograde. And that's also the midpoint of the entire cycle. And that is the point when the planet either opposes or conjuncts the sun. If it's a planet, like an outer planet so Mercury and Venus would be the inferior planets. If it's an outer planet, it's when the planet opposes the sun. Otherwise, for Mercury and Venus, it's when they conjunct the sun. That is what I call the solar point. That moment is what I call the solar point, because the sun is involved. And I actually even like to call it, I don't call it this, but I think about it as the solarization point, because you get that idea of that funky reverse imagery that happens with solarized photography. It's like something, so things are sort of shown up in a different way than what we've seen, and that allows us to get a more clarity on them. So that's how I like to think about it. I usually just call it the solar point for short, or you'll see it also sometimes as SP. Sometimes I write it that way when I'm taking notes. So then that happens at a specific degree in the cycle. And so when the planet is going in its first shadow period, direct in its first shadow period before it turns retrograde, it will cross over that point. And I call that a midpoint, the first midpoint. And then after the planet is done with its retrograde, it will go forward over that territory one more time, and it will once again cross over that solar point, that degree of that solar point. And I call that also a midpoint. So midpoint 1 and midpoint 2. And I think what those are, and this is just a theory, but I found it helpful. I think those are clarification and crisis points. They help us see what we need to see. So the retrograde moment itself, when the planet actually reaches the point where it turns retrograde, that represents the furthest boundary, that we could almost say the furthest developmental boundary that a planet has reached. And it turns back because it sees it's going to be entering into a new field of development, and so it goes back like in a hesitation, like a human developmental hesitation, so that it can gather itself, so that it can review whatever it needs to review, so that it can build or repair whatever foundations maybe got missed, so that it's prepared and so that it can enter this new territory and do the work of that new development. So these midpoints, this solar point and these midpoints, I think are can be clarifying points. We can think of the point where so the planet retrogrades, and it retrogrades back to a certain point, and we can think of that point, which is the point that it turns direct when it starts moving forward again. But that specific point, we can think of the thing that it's going back for, the thing that it needs to revisit and to get clarity about, and perhaps to do the work of, because maybe that got missed. And so that midpoint, or that solar point, perhaps acts as the clarification point that helps to clarify that thing that we're going back for, but also perhaps the difference between that point and the next point, that where we're going to. So that's how I conceive of this cycle. And not just Saturn retrograde, all retrograde cycles. So that's just backdrop. I'm not going to look at this entire cycle here, but I'm just pointing out the dates. But knowing how I think about it will give you context, help you understand why I'm thinking about the Saturn retrograde cycle in the way that I am. So anyway, so it reached its first, so it entered its retrograde period on April 6th. It reached its first midpoint on May 7th, and then now it's turning retrograde on the 13th. So it's appearing to move backwards in the sky from our perspective here on Earth. And then on the 21st, September 21st, it will reach its solar point. And then on November 27th, it will turn direct again. And then on January 30th, it will reach its second midpoint. And then on March 2nd, it will finish up the retrograde period. So from April 6th to March 2nd, we started in the retrograde, Saturn's retrograde cycle as a whole on April 6th. We'll end it on March 2nd. The retrograde period itself goes from July 13th to November 27th. So this is when we're going back, we're rethinking, we're revisiting, we're going back to that thing that we need that clarity on, and maybe a developmental piece that we need to better solidify and understand. So the tarot card, so Saturn turns retrograde at 1 degree 56 minutes, and my rough calculations give it 33 seconds. In my astrology program that I use, it says it's 3 seconds, but that's really very minimal. It's not a big deal. So that aligns with the first decan of Aries, which is here. That's ruled by Mars. And we'll see here, you can see here, Mars is at the point of this triangle pattern, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So Mars is a significant player. It's almost as though Saturn is saying, this Mars energy, this is the thing we have to work on. This is the thing that we have to maybe bring healthy boundaries to, Saturn, healthy boundaries to. So then, here we have the Two of Wands. And so that's what governs the card that is associated with the first decan of Aries is the Two of Wands. So we can think of this as the story of that 10-degree segment of the zodiac. And so that is here we'll just look at the image. So this is the one, I talked about this in my last reading of Uranus entering, I think it was for Uranus entering Gemini. And I had been misreading this. I had been reading this as a positive symbol of envisioning the future to come, but it's actually more complicated than that, based on how A.E. Waite describes it in his book. So divinatory meanings: between the alternative readings, there is no marriage possible. On the one hand, riches, fortune, magnificence. On the other, physical suffering, disease, chagrin, sadness, mortification. So, and then it gets really interesting here. The design gives one suggestion. Here is a lord overlooking his dominion and alternately contemplating a globe. It looks like the malady, the mortification, the sadness of Alexander, amidst the grandeur of this world's wealth. And I think that's maybe one of the most important symbolic imageries of the energies of this month. The idea of Alexander, we extol him, like just as a collective, we extol him as this great unifier. Yet he did it through this brutish conquest, this extraordinarily brutish conquest. In his own life, at the end of his life, my understanding, I haven't read it deeply, but my understanding is he was quite anxious, concerned about sort of, all the people around him kind of collapsing and wanting him dead so that they could take power. And it's sort of like, well, yes, when you create that, and I don't say this judgmentally at all, but obviously, I think we need to think about what we're holding up as the height or the epitome of humanity. Do we really want to come together through those kinds of means? Can we do it differently? Can we do it better? So that's the imagery, this imagery of conquest and this need to build up walls. The person in this image is standing on the battlement, so the castle that's been built is there to protect them from forces that want to harm them. And so it's sort of this territorial thing that's happened, and he's looking out at his own protectorate, you could say. But how did he get that protectorate, right? Like, was that gotten through violent means? It's just this cycle that doesn't end, perhaps. And so we end up having to put walls around us to protect ourselves, really, in a sense, from the repercussions of our own actions, we could say. Where this all began, who knows? And is there legitimate reason to put walls around ourselves and protect ourselves? Yes, but if we can go into the deeper vibration of that, the deeper look at that, perhaps we can see that what we're getting back is our own, what we have grooved into being because of enculturated patterns due to trauma, however that trauma began. So then how I look at this is then the Sabian symbol. So there's a Sabian symbol for each degree. So we can think about that as the planet's relationship to this tarot card, to this imagery, to this story, to this narrative of the tarot card. And so the comedian, it's an interesting thing, right? We can read a comedian and it's like a comedian entertaining a group or something like that. So is the comedian, is it helping us see where we are in a way? This is one way that comedy can be used. It can help us see where we are so that we can better understand it, so that we can heal from it and we can move on from it if it's not helpful for us. Or a comedian can also simply bring us all together and laughing at ourselves, but as a way of how do I want to say it? Like, we laugh because we're all part of the same thing, and we go home and we go to sleep. We don't change anything. It's like, ha ha ha, yeah, let's go home and let's keep doing it, right? Like, so it sort of gives us a sense of belonging, but it's not a belonging that's based on consciousness and awareness and an understanding that perhaps the way that we're living isn't actually serving us individually and all of us collectively in the highest ways possible. And can we change that? And then comedy can also be used to harm people, to cut people down and to keep people in their place. So it can be used as this hierarchical thing, right? So the comedian is really interesting, and perhaps the Two of Wands is telling us that to the extent that the comedy, the state of comedy in our world today is about a kind of a complacence with where things are, is maybe a way of allowing us to form tribes of belonging as opposed to really helping us understand where we are and move beyond where we are. Perhaps that's giving us some insight there. 2 degrees of Aries is interesting. I think I talked about this in the Uranus Gemini chart, or Uranus ingressing into Gemini chart. It's at the beginning of the zodiac on the natural wheel, so it's sort of like comedy is one of the important things, the things that we, tools you could almost see that we need as we go through life. And then the question is, how do we use that tool? And so we can consider right now the role of comedy in our lives, what we're resonating with, how we're relating to that comedy. Is it allowing us to remain complacent? Is it helping us to understand where we are and helping us to see it in clearer ways so that we can continue to evolve and develop? All of that kind of things. Are we using it to harm one another? I grew up in an environment where we use comedy to harm one another, just in, like sarcasm and all that kind of stuff. And I was, really good at it. And so when I talk about, are we using comedy to harm one another, I'm talking about, from personal experience. So it's not meant to judge or accuse anybody. It's just a recognition that that's one of the patterns that can play out in us and others. So then we have this triangle pattern in the chart. And the triangle, well, actually, before we do that, let's look at one more bit of context. Let's look here. So everything happens within the moon phase, right? So here we had the full moon on July 10th, and I talked about that in the Capricorn full moon reading. And that reading I felt was about this idea of kind of whose mountain are we climbing, and the request being to discover who we are, I suppose you could say. The understanding that if we have a society where we're not allowing children to develop into who they are, and we're not supporting one another in touching in to our essence, to who we are, and helping us walk the path of those and develop those, then we develop compensation patterns and suppression patterns and all that kind of stuff. And we just create this world of always overburdening one another. And we end up on the top of the mountain and we don't know who we are. And that's because of these kind of patterns and expectations that we've grooved into being as society, and the requirement that's put in place to ensure that we adhere to these group expectations to create an external sense of security, rather than fostering within each of us, helping us each develop an internal sense of security, so we don't have to keep everybody in line so that we can feel safe and secure. So the moon in this chart has moved from Capricorn to Aquarius. So that's suggesting that the energy of this Saturn retrograde, and Saturn in traditional astrology rules not only Capricorn but also Aquarius. So there's this idea of moving beyond the Capricornian requirement to the Aquarian requirement, you could say. And the Aquarian requirement is individuation, is developing, touching into who we are and developing that essence. And each of us has a unique genius, and how do we and learning that and developing that, and then bringing that into our communities and offering that as our gift of service to community, and in that way elevating all of us, all boats rise together, that sort of thing. So that's the context. And then within that, we have this interesting, in this chart for Saturn retrograde, we have this triangle pattern. It's not an official triangle pattern. This is not a grand trine. What this is what I call a developmental triangle, developmental trine. And I call it that because each of these aspects aligns with one of the phase points on the wheel, the points where the phases transition from one phase or another. So it's made up of two sesquiquadrates. That's 135 degrees. And that falls either at 15 degrees of Leo or 15 degrees of Scorpio. So if you count forward on the wheel from 0 degrees Aries, you get 30, 60, 90, 120, and then 15 brings you to 15 degrees of Leo, 135 degrees. And if you count backwards, 30, 60, 90, 120, and then 15, that brings you to 15 degrees of Scorpio. So the beginning of the gibbous phase and the beginning of the harvest phase. So these ideas of practice and skill development and choice and metamorphosis and commitment, choice and commitment, we could say. So this 135 degree between Chiron and Mars is a waxing 135 degrees, so it's falling here at 15 degrees of Leo, and Mercury is at 14 degrees of Leo, and it's going to turn retrograde at 15 degrees of Leo and some change. And so it's going to reach this peak point, this shift from the first quarter phase to the gibbous phase, and this peak point of the quadrant cycle. So the quadrant, this is the second quadrant, Cancer, Leo, Virgo. 15 degrees of Leo is the midpoint of this quadrant. This is about our creativity and expression, this quadrant. Expressing who we are. The first quadrant is discovering who we are, we could say. The second quadrant is expressing who we are. And so Mercury is going to turn retrograde right at this point. And this point is a shift from outer yang energy to inner yin energy. And it's this idea of we express our light, and we express the peak of that light. And then we go into a waning cycle. So here's the waxing part of the cycle. Then we go into a waning part of the cycle, and that waning part is about integrating. So what are we integrating here? It's about integrating, internalizing. So what are we integrating and internalizing? We're integrating and internalizing our light. And then we move into Virgo, and it's about learning the skill and craft of our light, so that we can be a channel for the light of spirit. Opposite of Virgo is Pisces. The light of spirit, we can then be a channel for that, and the light can flow through us, and we can be the prisms through which that light then shines. So something like that. So, and then this sesquiquadrate between Mars and Pluto, and Pluto is the soul. This is an evolutionary astrology take. Pluto is the soul, and Mars enacts the will of the soul. That's how evolutionary astrology sees it. So these two are definitely interconnected, interrelated, and they are in a waning sesquiquadrate. So that falls here at 15 degrees of Scorpio. And that's about this idea of choice. So there's this idea of the choice. How are we going to choose to enact the desires of the soul? How are we going to choose to continue our warring ways and sort of our brutish ways? Or are we going to choose to refine our action principles? So the Sabian symbol for Mars at 14 degrees of Virgo, and we read at 15 degrees of Virgo. If we go down here, it's a handkerchief, and it's like an ornamental handkerchief, or it's a white handkerchief, and it's this idea of it has this idea of an heirloom to it, so something we inherit. So it's something delicate. And the thing is, and if, by the way, if you were paying attention earlier, you might have noticed that I had orangutan here instead of handkerchief, and that's because I was reading at 16 degrees I was thinking in my mind 15 degrees, so I read 16 degrees, and that's where orangutan is. But this is actually a handkerchief. Both work actually quite well, but the actual Sabian symbol is the delicate handkerchief. And that fits, like if we think about, if our culture, if we have been in the habit of war, and we can think in terms of literal war or war within ourselves, or just not at peace within ourselves, because perhaps of inherited trauma and all that kind of stuff, and war itself, whatever kind of war we're engaging in, whatever level we're engaging in, keeping that trauma going and creating trauma. And so we're kind of constantly in this cycle of trauma. We become delicate, in terms of our emotions and our skill, our ability to process our emotions. And it's not because we're failing or failures or anything. It's just because that's what trauma does. It's very difficult. You have to heal the trauma before you can start to be able to work with and ground your emotion. we could also say learning how to work with and develop the skill of our emotions can also be part of the healing process. In terms of trauma, that was certainly true for me. But everybody's path is unique and different, so I don't want to tell people what's true for them. But we can see this connection between trauma and war. So Pluto in Aquarius having to do with trauma, and Mars having to do with war, and Saturn in Aries having to do with war. And we can think of Saturn there and looking at it from this perspective as this restriction that the trauma has caused, that the warring has caused, because it's caused this trauma. So a limitation in our ability to process our skill, our ability to process our emotions. So the handkerchief can represent that kind of delicacy, and that's been passed down to us through the generations, through the human generations that have been stuck in this cycle of trauma and war. But it can also represent the refinement that being able to process our emotions allows us to step into and make different choices, so that we don't choose war. Because as we process our emotions, we don't have to act them out in the ways that we did before, and we can develop greater empathy and understanding, and seek to develop skills of cooperation and relationship. And how can we build structures, Saturn structures? This is, to me, the big question right now. How do we build structures, that are imbued with compassion, that the structures themselves facilitate the creation of a compassionate world, where everybody's needs are met, and the structures, create environments where people, children, and anybody else, their needs are met, and they're supported in developing who they are and their gifts and talents, so that they can bring those into the collective, instead of this sort of hierarchical meritocracy, superiority type thing, where some people get to have and other people don't. And so the idea of this handkerchief, talking about this idea of delicacy and the fragility on the one hand, and the competence, Saturn ruler of Capricorn, the competence, the mastery that is possible in terms of our emotions, and that perhaps being the key, that unlocks our ability to move into this more refined level of our human expression. So that, by the way, was an interlude because I had the wrong Sabian symbol. So now I'm going to go back to the original video where it left off. So, and so this idea of choice, we have a choice point. Are we going to choose to dissipate our light through these warring ways? So whenever we're choosing war, we're always choosing trauma. And as long as we're choosing trauma, we can't internalize our light. We can't integrate our light because we're being wounded by the trauma. So are we going to choose a different way that will allow each of us to actually access our light, each of us to actually integrate our light? Or are we going to choose, to continue the way we're going? And personally, I think the energies just aren't going to support the warring ways anymore. I don't know that there's really, I think the choice maybe has been made, and it's just a matter of time before the energies shift, and it just isn't going to be part of our reality. I think that what we're seeing is the final expression, the final manifestation of this old energy, this old tendency, this old habit. And so that's what I'm thinking. Am I a psychic? Am I a seer? No, I'm not. That's just how I'm seeing it, and I can be definitely idealistic, but that is what I feel like the energies of the chart are saying. So if we go down, now we can go down here, and we can look at the tarot cards and the Sabian symbols for these other points. So, and also for Mars. So here we have Mars. We see the orangutan, and the Nine of Pentacles is interesting, right? This is this imagery of refinement. And here is where I think we can read the chart in two ways. So this imagery of refinement speaks of a choice that we can make. Are we going to choose the brutish ways, or are we going to choose a more refined way of being? But this could also potentially, this isn't how A.E. Waite talks about it. He talks about divinatory meanings are prudence, safety, success, accomplishment, certitude, discernment. Reversed would be roguery, deception, voided, project, bad faith. So this reverse sort of speaks about our warring ways and the deception that's sort of at the root of that, as sort of a tactic or a strategy. And then this is more about a choice for a different way. But we could also, thinking about the moon having moved from Capricorn to Aquarius, we could also, if we look at that, sort of see somebody who's living up to an ideal, an image of what it means to be a refined human, and potentially meeting the expectations, external expectations, and not really tapping into their essence. The bird suggests that this person is, I think, tapped into its essence. It's listening to its spirit. But if you just, it's a this to me, when I look at it, it's like, wow, this is somebody really kind of posing in this particular way. So you could potentially think of it as, are we truly living who we are, or are we living up to an image that others have defined for us and have asked us to, sort of demanded sometimes us to be? And because the structure is the structure right now, there hasn't been the possibility of supporting something different. The energy has been on getting us to conform to this general structure, this general idea, this general way of being. And so have we been able to access to who we are? And if not, then the Aquarian energy speaks of this idea of a rupture, an inability perhaps to continue on, a breakdown perhaps. And I don't mean that in psychological terms, but I just mean the pattern not really maintaining anymore, sustaining anymore. And so we're having to reckon with that, and we're having to perhaps learn who we are. And it also speaks about that this, to me, it also speaks about this is the direction of humanity. That this is the next step. To the extent that none of us are living who we are, then we can get lost. We can get misled. Like, we can then be, if we're not in touch with who we are, we're not going to experience inner security. And to the extent that we're not experiencing inner security, we're going to try to get it for ourselves. I can't think of the word. We're going to try to get that for ourselves by imposing external boundaries and warring with people to ensure those boundaries are in place, and even extending those, violating the boundaries of others to ensure that we have that external safety to compensate for the internal safety that hasn't yet been achieved. So that is one way to think about that. And then if we look at, let's look at Pluto. Pluto is here, a deserter from the Navy. So it's 5 of Swords. This is really, really interesting to see. Is that really right? So 5 of Swords, you can see this is this warring way. This is what isn't working. This is like somebody thinks he's really won, and but he's not realizing he's really lost, because everybody else is hurt and harmed, and that by definition is lost, and he's hurt and harmed and doesn't realize it. He thinks because he won, everything's good, but it isn't. And then a deserter from a Navy, I think it's a deserter from a Navy. It's not working anymore. We can't do it anymore. The energy isn't there anymore. The moon is in Aquarius now. It's not in Capricorn. We can't do it anymore. We can't maintain the old stories anymore. That's what that's suggesting to me. And then we have Chiron here in Aries. And that, if we look down, I hope this isn't bothering people. Sorry about that. The Chiron here, 4 of Wands. Now here's where it gets interesting. So this looks like a really good image, right? This is a really wonderful image. And what A.E. Waite says about it, they are for once almost on the surface, country life, haven of refuge, a species of domestic harvest, home, repose, concord, harmony, prosperity, peace, and the perfected work of these. Reversed, the meaning remains unaltered. It is prosperity, increase, felicity, beauty, embellishment. So it's just saying that's what that card means, period, the end. And this is a disappointed audience. Well, how do you make sense of those two things? Well, perhaps one possible way to read that, you can see here there's a castle in the background, so that suggests that this harmony, harvest, home, etc. has been won on the pattern of harming, of one another harming oneself. And the castle is giving you the external support, external safety, but the internal safety hasn't actually been won. And it's interesting, they have their arms raised over their head, so there's this idea of victory in that, right? And so it's possibly we could read it as speaking to an old paradigm. And now that paradigm isn't working anymore. That victory, it's not working, and there's a disappointed audience, right? Yeah, we've won that, we've initiated the new war, and nobody's happy about that anymore. It used to be, let's go, and everybody goes to war. But now it's like, why did you do that, right? And or we've come home and we've won the war, and it's like, that story just isn't holding me anymore. So and to me and I think that we're seeing that, and that's suggesting that the times, the energetic times, the energy underlying these times is not supporting that old story anymore. And we can bless that old story because it was what sustained us, it's what made it possible for us to go through these times. It carried us through these times. But the times are changing because humanity is healed more. It's done, a lot of humanity has done a lot of deep healing work, I believe. And so that's making possible this new energy to come through, to come forward. So I think what I'll do is leave it there. And then we are going to have Mars conjuncting the South Node on July 20th. I'm probably not going to look at that chart, but it might be worth looking at. It'll give more insight potentially for what this time is about. So let's just look at Nine of Pentacles is that refinement again, and the caravan. A caravan, I think it's going to the west. I'm not 100% sure how to read this. I'm inclined to read this as when I think about a caravan, I think of, and especially as it heading to the west, I think about sort of the United States and the old pioneering spirit of people moving out west. And I think about things like the need, either a hyper-individualist energy or a hyper-collective energy, and a strict requirement for conformity. If you think about the United States in the early days, the religious conformity. There was this great movie called, I looked it up. It's called Sweetland. It is such a precious movie. It is a gem of a movie. It is beautiful. It's about an immigrant woman who moves to the United States back in the pioneer days. And it's in the Midwest. Beautiful cinematography, and just really, really incredible acting, and just really a beautiful movie. And it's about how she came and this man came to marry one another, and then sort of the judgment of the community and all that kind of stuff. And it's just, I really recommend it. That, I think, it gives the idea, about this judgment that happens. And there is this incredible judgment that's happening in the world right now. It's like everybody's sort of found their tribe and their whatever, and they're coming together in these judgmental. It's like their judgment is what's cohering them together, instead of, the community helping them understand who they are, helping them understand that we're all different, helping them understand that there are different perspectives. perhaps one way to think about these times is we're waking up to the fact, the story, the metaphor about the blind people and the elephant, the blind men and the elephant, right? That's the world we've been living in. We're all sort of fractured into all these different groups, and everybody's saying, I've got the truth, I've got the truth, I've got the truth, and we've all got the truth, right? So, and war feeds on that energy of tribalism and this person thinking they have the truth and that person thinking they have the truth, or not person but group or whatever, and then the judgment that comes into play from there. The incredibly harsh judgment. These times, by the way, are still, they're still linked to, energetically, astrologically, they still link back to the Salem witch trials. The charts for that time, and there's a lot of Gemini energy in that chart, and it's this idea, for me, when I think about Gemini, and especially in relationship to Capricorn, it's this idea of, are we requiring the child, it's Gemini, early education, right? Early childhood, early training, you could say. Are we in early community? Are we requiring the child to bend to our will? We can think about will with Mars involved here, and Saturn in Aries, Saturn ruler of Capricorn in Aries. Are we requiring the child to bend to our will? Are those the structures we put into place, or are we putting into place structures that support the child in knowing who they are? And each of us, and continuing to do that throughout the lives of every person, so the adults too. And in these times, I think we especially need structures that support healing, because there's been so much trauma. Anyway, I got a little bit off topic, but not entirely. It is relevant, and I keep thinking about the Salem witch trials charts, and I keep wanting to talk about them, but they haven't really come through. So perhaps this was when I was supposed to talk about it. So anyway, I will leave it there. Thank you so much for listening. I hope there was something helpful. I just also really want to say thank you to everybody who has listened, who has subscribed. If you haven't subscribed and you appreciate what I'm sharing, please subscribe, either here on Substack or here on YouTube, wherever you're listening to this. If you want to support me with a paid subscription, you can do that over on Substack. You just have to click on the subscribe button in the post, and that will bring up options for you to subscribe. So thank you so much for tuning in. Take good care, and take what works and leave the rest. If this was helpful for you, that is what matters. If it wasn't helpful for you, that matters too. That's your answer. It wasn't helpful for you. It's not the right thing. You can just let it go. You can just leave it behind. So with that said, I will end it there, and thank you again. Take care. Bye.